Good morning. Thanks so much for joining us, and absolutely delighted to have you here and to be joined by John Hattie. We'll leave the professor out at the moment. Wendy Delph, who's the Master Trainer for Visible Learning, works with schools all over the country.
Morning, everyone.
And Katie and Jacob. And what we're going to be doing today is looking at all things learning and how we put learning first and central. And so we're going to kick off and get straight into the learning mode to begin with. And then we're going to come back to the learning survey afterwards. So we're going to be going straight into what putting learning first means and this whole visible learning journey, what it looks like, but what it can look like at different levels and for different groups of people. So we're going to meet Katie and Jacob again a bit later, Wendy a bit later, but John and I are going to kick off this section, if that sounds all right, John. And we're going to go straight into, if you had to explain in a nutshell what visible learning is, could you kind of just...
Well, the irony in some ways is the name, because for most times learning actually isn't visible. That's the reason I called it that, because the aim is to make how students and teachers go about processing information, thinking about things, what strategies they're using. And of course, learning is always about something. So how do they go about choosing what they're going to focus on, what the priorities are? And so that whole focus of learning, I wish there was a lot more focus, Stephen, on learning in schools than teaching. Of course, teaching is important, but it's a means to an end. The end is to enhance the learning capabilities, the learning strategies, the love of learning. I just get fascinated when you see a lot of students today, particularly teenagers, love learning on their video games, not on their sport. We got to turn them on to learning on the things that we see as precious in our schools.
So that gives us a kind of feel. Now, I know there's been a lot of work talking about the kind of research and evidence-based. To me, this is what I'm kind of seeing is it's three distinct things. So the first thing being, yes, there is a lot of research work going out in education, and that's publishing it out there and making sure people understand it, be that through RCTs, randomly controlled trials, or be it through evaluative methods, or be that quantitative, qualitative, but getting that research nailed. I think the second element for the kind of evidence-based or research-based that I'm seeing is, okay, so what's the base in your school, in your context? How do you know these things are working, and do they work with those, and does that research actually translate? Because I know Dylan says so little research is actually replicated to understand that. And then the third element seems to be around this research base around the implementation, because we know how important it is to get these things in place, but is something working because we're brilliant at putting it in place and implementing it, or is it not working because we haven't actually implemented it well? So understanding our capacity to actually be able to implement. So I'd just be interested in your thoughts on that.
Yeah, like in the early days, there was a lot of emphasis on, I put a lot of emphasis on the research that came out of the literature and all that kind of media. But then that second form that you said is, teachers are surrounded by evidence, the observations, their interpretations, their collegiality in terms of how they interpret things. And in many ways, we've got so much evidence now that maybe the days of evidence are over. Like EFF has got evidence. I've got a third of a million students in my database. You got to ask, do we really need more evidence? The days of mobilizing and implementing it are there. Excuse me. I got so excited that I got coughing. One of the things that I certainly want to do was look at how you know your impact. And that begs teachers to look for evidence in their own classrooms. So, I think those three things are pretty critical, but it all comes back to the interpretations that we make.
And so those interpretations then are where we need really skilling up on and really understanding, because, and I know you make this distinction, I think Dylan makes that distinction as well, between whether teachers should be researchers or whether they should be evaluators of the practice. And I know I'll get into this evaluation thing a bit deeper, but what lies at the nub of that for you?
Well, every time a teacher makes a decision, in a sense, they're acting like a researcher, they're acting like an evaluator. And I think we've got to be very careful here that we don't ask teachers to become researchers in the sense they are more than consumers of researchers, interpreters of researchers. And as we're going to come back to, I'm much more a fan that we give them those evaluation skills, because that word in evaluation, value. How do we value What information do we value? How do we interpret that so we make those decisions about significance and worth and merit? And those are really important skills that teachers have. And certainly right at the moment, you know, as I've worked in your schools in the UK, there are so many teachers who have a lot of those evaluative skills. Some, however, don't. They have one lens. They see the classroom through their eyes. They can't see the classroom through the student's eyes. They see the student's work and they can't see how the student sees their work. And those are the real skills of evaluation that we need to build up. And that's critical to where we're going to go. And I know in our discussion, Stephen, in terms of the whole debate about student voice, like I'm not a great fan of student voice for the sake of voice, but I am a great fan of understanding how the students speak about their learning, the way in which they articulate it. It's not easy to do, but it's really critical if we're going to help those kids improve in terms of what they do and what we value.
So I think we're getting pretty precise there on what we mean by putting learning first and what those components of learning. Now, I know you've been doing some work as well and looking at where the balance is. And I had a fascinating, I was talking to somebody who interviewed 10 CEOs of MATS to find out why people make the decisions they do with leaving schools. And one of the reasons they were saying as a conclusion was that the MIS, or the management information systems behind schools, measure things like attendance, they measure behavior, they measure school grades. And what becomes really obvious is if attendance falls down, therefore you need to get attendance up, because it's almost the first thing. If the kids aren't accessing education, we've got to act on that. As soon as we act on that, then we have a problem with behavior, because often those last few children in the class are the ones who perhaps aren't as switched on to learning as some of the others, so it becomes more difficult. So there tends to predominate this kind of conversation between attendance and behavior. And yet then when the government gets involved, it's often curriculum that they want to focus on, because that seems to do the big sexy things, if you like, which grabs the headlines and it looks like you're doing something. But what we're seeing is there's very little effect size in those. Yes, if you haven't got access and you have got access, it does make a difference, but behavior hasn't. But we know with teaching, it's got a kind of 0.4 average effect size from your work, if we're going on that one. But learning seems to offer an awful lot more than that. So it's kind of, but yet what we're seeing, or what we've been observing, is kind of 80% plus of the time is spent on teaching, not on learning. Is that something you're finding worldwide over?
Yeah, when we did Amy Berry and our team did a survey of teachers a couple of years about their concept of engagement. And unfortunately, the most common notion is that teachers argue kids are engaged when they are doing the work, or they're engaged in the work, they're doing it. Sadly, in a lot of doing, there's not a lot of learning. It's just doing. And no wonder kids get bored. No wonder they get turned off. There's no challenge in it. There's no excitement. There's no wonder. There's no curiosity. There's no sense that they are being challenged and therefore will fail and then can come back and learn. And so that whole notion of teaching and looking at it through the eyes of the teachers, I think is unfortunate, because, of course, as you said, getting the kids to class, getting them invited to come into the class, getting the behavioral management right, they're all kind of preconditions, but that's not what makes the difference. It's that next step of helping students and that joy. Like, go back to their video games. They play video games because they are continually learning. We've got to think of the same way in the classroom. How do we get kids continually learning our maths and our physics and our English and our music and our phys ed? And I think this is the art of teaching. And one of the things I'd ask all our listeners today is, what is their model of learning? And is it shared by other teachers? Is it shared by students? And as I've asked that question, and we've asked it with Osiris in many different schools, most teachers don't have a theory of learning. They have theories of teaching, but they just think that kids learn like they learned, or they think that it's a function of whether they are bright or not, what backgrounds they have. But I think we need to know a lot more about how each of our students are learning. We need to teach them lots of different learning strategies and understand it. One of the things we do is ask the students, what does it mean to learn in this class? And sometimes it's a little frightening. It's all about compliance and doing the work and finishing it. Well, no wonder a lot of our students start to get turned off as they go through our schooling system.
So it might be useful then just to unpick, learning strategies work, because I think that's fairly unfamiliar territory for most people. And I know you've done quite a lot of work into that. People are familiar with trying to teach a learning strategy to students in their subject, and hopefully they'll apply it. But I think what you're talking about is innate learning strategies, and how do we develop and polish those? Is that?
Yeah, that's very much it. Like, we did a meta-synthesis of around 400 different learning strategies. We worked out the top 12 to 20. The problem is that some of those strategies work when you're learning content, and different strategies work when you're trying to relate ideas and transfer. So it's not a simple translation of saying, here's the top 12 or 20. But some of them came out, the students don't know how to outline and summarize. If they don't know how to seek relationships, if they don't know how to deconstruct a question before they even answer it, if they don't have any sense of high expectations about themselves, if they don't see that not succeeding means they need to learn more, as opposed to not succeeding means they're dummies. And there's a lot of strategies around that we need to know, firstly, as teachers, what strategies the kids have. Like, one thing we do know, Stephen, if you apply a strategy that doesn't work, applying it again means it probably won't work again. But that's what a lot of kids do. So we need to give them multiple strategies so they know what to do when they don't know what to do. And that's why that focus on learning is so powerful in our classrooms.
And I think, we're becoming more aware of unconscious bias and our biases in certain behaviours, but what we haven't got that awareness is our biases in learning, because they're so innate and buried in us in many ways, and no one's really unpicked that conversation.
And there's a bit of a conspiracy in a way too, because if you look at the students that we typically call high achieving students, quite often they are very good at retention and consolidation of knowledge. And in some ways that feeds us as teachers in saying, well, actually they're good at that. Maybe I'm doing a good job because they know lots. But unfortunately, it's not about only knowing lots. It's about then relating the ideas. It's about dealing with those wicked problems. And sometimes our above average students don't like that. They want to play the game they're winners. And that's just learning lots and lots of stuff. And then you get the kids at the other end of the distribution who think that knowing lots is what this class is about. Well, actually, most classes aren't about knowing lots. It's knowing sufficient so you can go deeper and relate it. And I think one of the interesting things in a lot of COVID teaching is teachers had to cut the breadth of the curriculum so they could go deeper. And I think it was a much more worthwhile task for teachers and students. But as you said, governments love to fiddle and tweak curricula. That's very unfortunate. I wish they were a lot more savvy about having less so we can go deeper.
So the overall learning game, my understanding is it's about zero by changing the curriculum, mainly because it takes about 3 to 5 years to embed a new curriculum. And, while you're doing that, you're not really...
Stephen, it's never embedded. I reckon I went into every classroom in the UK. I'd have different teachers and schools interpreting the curriculum. And if you look at the last 20 years, what we've done in curriculum, we've tweaked the edges, we've raised controversial issues that's got on the front page of the newspaper. But in general, changing curricula, of course we want good curricula, but why we spend so much time doing that when that's not the biggest impact?
And I know you've been looking at the technology one as well to sort of see if that's given us any advantage. It'd be good to elucidate that one a little bit for people.
Well, technology's improved dramatically over the last 50 years. But there's over 200 meta-analyses now, and the average effect size, which is pretty low, hasn't changed despite that change. And so I think the question is, why has technology not had the influence? And it's partly because we've substituted kids doing paper mache and doing projects for now they do videos and all these kinds of things. So it's, in a sense, there's nothing wrong with that. But I think, again, if you look at what happened during COVID teaching, the biggest advance in technology is in our face. The social media aspects. Kids are more likely to talk about what they don't know to their friends and to the teacher over social media, and they won't do it if you're standing beside them. And so I think there's lots of exciting ways. Now, of course, social media's got its downsides, but there's lots of exciting ways that we could use technology. Teachers are huge users of social media in their own lives. How do we use that to do a lot of our professional learning and our linking and getting people right across the nation and across schools starting to talk to each other and work across each other? I think there's exciting things to come in technology. It's just at the moment, it hasn't had the kind of impact that everybody's promised us.
Absolutely. If you've got any questions for John, do ping them in and we'll try and get them in. We've got a lot to get through here, but the chat room's open. We'll articulate those and move them on. So we're saying then the focus is too much on the doing, the teaching, not enough on the learning. We're not really getting to the bottom of what the learning is. And I'd just like to explore it a little bit further on an individual basis, because it's a hunch, and I wonder if you can confirm it. But those learners who thrive tend to have quite a few learning strategies, not necessarily completely polished, but they're using multiple learning strategies. So when they're getting stuck, they're able to switch to another learning strategy. Those who are really struggling perhaps have a limited range, perhaps even only one learning strategy. And when that fails, they tend to go to give up mode. And that's quite a fundamental issue, I guess. Yeah, we're just going to nod there. That's all right. And then, so the teaching assistants obviously are working with a lot of those students, and do they understand that? Yeah, I'm always fascinated by the low impact that they're giving, and yet the amount of training that they have, and when you speak to them, they really do understand how to develop literacy, how to develop numeracy. But I'm just wondering whether it is that issue around understanding learning strategies which lies at the heart of this.
Yeah, look, I don't want to go completely overboard. All those other things are important. But yes, absolutely, it is understanding the strategies of the kid. And if you look at Peter Blatchford's work, and I think he's done the most exciting work on teacher assistants, is they've got to stop doing the work for the students. They've got to start seeing what it looks like from the student's point of view. And, this is a big ask to ask them now to add teaching the strategies of learning. But sadly, too often, the kids who most need the experts don't get the experts. And I think that if we could use teaching aids differently in our classrooms across students, regardless of ability, we'd have much bigger impact than we do at the moment. And so asking teaching aids to have more, I think is a little unreasonable. But I think this is where the teachers need to take on using the teaching aids differently. But I know that sometimes rules and laws that you can't do that, which is very sad. But I'm a fan of the expertise of the teachers doing this. And the starting point, and I know this is where we start off when Osiris and group work in schools, is helping teachers understanding that learning. Like, isn't it kind of ironic that across the UK you have incredible number of assessments of achievement, but how many assessments of learning do you have? And therein lies the problem.
That's zero, John, as far as we can find, anyway.
Yeah, exactly. And I think Stephen, it's incumbent upon us to work with teachers, to work with schools to help build up some more knowledge about the teaching of those strategies. Like over the years, you've had people like Noel Entwistle and others in the UK that have been trying to do this. They've been in the wind, as it were. But I think we can be a lot more systematic, and that's what we've been working on, as you know, for the last few years, is how do we get smarter at helping teachers and kids look at those strategies, know when to teach them, how do you build it into lesson design, and how do you know that you're improving things? I think those are really pretty important questions.
So if we can get into kind of slightly more, we've got lots of good suggestions there, and let's focus on some of those areas. So if I'm a school with no money for professional development or school improvement because of whatever reasons, priorities lie elsewhere, or it's just the way it's cut. So I've got to use a DIY model, if you like. Where would I start? If it was you, where would you direct people to start? If it's DIY, they've got to do. If they're an individual or if they're a collective?
Well, the DIY solution, I think, is very simple. I want you to do a random interview with various kids in various classes in your school and ask them, what does it mean to be a good learner in this class? Or ask them, who's the best learner in this class and why? Do the same with your teachers. And certainly what we've found is that teachers usually have quite a rich description of what a good learner is. Put that up on a smart board in the staff room, and then put up on the staff room what the students are saying in those same classrooms. If they're aligned, this is not your problem. You're doing a great job. But more often than not, the kids think good learners are students who come to class well prepared, sit up straight, and watch the teacher work, the compliance model. And that's totally inconsistent to what we find that teachers say. Teachers say learning's a struggle, learning's hard work, learning's messy. Learning is working at the cusp of not knowing and knowing. And if you've got a difference, you've got a major, major problem. And this is why the whole visible learning, look at learning through the eyes of the students. So that's where I'd start. And you can then start to say, well, from the next step is, well, what are we going to do in the school to be smarter about building what desirable learning attributes in the school are? So that's where I'd start with the DIY model.
So that can be done in your classroom with your kids that you're teaching now, or it can be done across the school if you've got to. Now,
it's always smarter to do it across the school.
Now, very vogue these days is the kind of notion of drive teams, which I know comes out of the Kotter work as a system of change. I mean, it has its problems, we know, because it can overload certain individuals. And the other problem with a drive team is the adoption across a school. You can often create a veneer. So if I'm a drive team, we've got a lot of senior leaders, well, mainly senior leaders here. Where would you start if you were the drive team and you were set up with, let's orientate this, if we're saying it's 85% teaching now and a lot less learning, how do we switch that more to learning? Where would you start with that?
Well, the place I'd love to start, Stephen, is de-implementation, choosing something to stop. Because you're right, adding more and more and more is just not helping at all. But I know it's very reluctant in schools to stop things. But I don't think it takes a lot to find out your students' conception of learning. And that's the fuel and the engine that's going to drive you to improving things. So that's the way what I take it is there's got to be a good motivation here for teachers to see what it's like in their class through the eyes of the students. Very powerful.
Yeah, it's interesting because I know the Dutch notion of change is you've got to take out at least as much as you're going to put in before you even start it. I think in Singapore and Hong Kong, they take out twice as much in the kind of gardening metaphor and then makes the soil really organic before they even try sowing. Certainly England, I'll speak as being English, they tend to cram more and more in until we're kind of finally just making so little improvement progress overall because we are trying to carry so many implementation teams. So that's a really good start. Now, obviously,
but it leads you nicely on to, I know where you're going to go next, the next step. More often than not, sometimes you need the honest broker. You need that professional learning person to come in and say, let's stop doing this and doing this. It's very hard for a school to do it because it's risky. We've been collecting this data for 20 years. If we get rid of it, what will happen? Well, you've never used it for 20 years. Oh, yes, but we've been collecting it. And an honest broker can say, well, let's put it aside. And look what happened in COVID. You put so much aside, and it didn't really, the world didn't stop. Learning continued.
Yeah. And I think this is, the great time to consolidate the gains of COVID, if you like, in some ways. So then we move on to the kind of, if we're taking an external team in to help us on that journey, which is kind of, I guess this is where visible learning fits into the whole picture as well. So what's the benefits of doing it that way?
Well, I think that when people say to us, Stephen, that they want visible learning, the question back is, and what is the problem for which visible learning is the answer? And as you know, one of the things that we do in schools right up front is do a capability matrix of what's happening in the school. We help the school do this. And we don't actually take it away and do it because we want the teachers and the school principal to realize that sometimes what they're asking for in school improvement isn't going to make much difference because it isn't really what the issue is. More often than not, the issue is getting the teachers working together in a safe environment in the staff room on problems of practice in their school and identifying those. And this, again, is where that honest broker can come in and can really say, look, principal, let's focus there rather than there. So getting the right problems on the table that leads to improvement. And Vivian Robinson, she's a great fan of saying, let's have less change. Let's have more improvement. Sometimes we just change because it's the latest glossy thing. It's the latest sounding thing. Some people say to me, oh, yeah, we did visible learning. Well, you don't do anything. It's a way of thinking about clearly identifying a problem, maximizing the probability of where you're going to put your money and your investment to improve, and then making sure you carry the whole school with you. Doing it one by one is not going to be enough. So that's the next stage, is really focusing on really good problem definition, really good understanding. And the beauty of doing that is you got your baseline. So as you go through the improvement, you can go back and look, how am I going compared to where I were? And that doesn't happen enough in schools.
Okay, so we're talking quite a fundamental change in process. I think the other thing we see is a lot of schools get caught in problem solving because there's so many problems within a school, and you can run into those cycles of problem solving. It's quite hard to look at that whole complexity, and this is, I think, uniquely what Visible Learning did. And so at this point, what we're going to do is we're going to come onto the learning survey and actually get into the minutiae of what we were looking at and what constitutes learning in a moment. But I'm just going to welcome Katie and Wendy, and Wendy's going to just talk us through how the Visible Learning process works, and how we work with the schools. And then Katie will be chatting with you in a moment, and then we're coming back onto the learning survey in a moment.
Okay, thank you, Stephen. Well, I think just what John has been talking about shows that if I was sitting here at the moment as a senior leader, it's, well, what does this look like? How do I get Visible Learning into my school? And what do I need to do as a leader to ensure that it's going to make the difference? So the process that we go through is that, first of all, Katie will do a training needs analysis with you in your school, and that will give you a chance to think about where you are, what you need, and how we can help you. If you decide that Visible Learning as a program is something that you want to take on, then I can provide you with an initial informal discussion. This program covers 3 years of your professional development time. So we need to be thinking about very clearly what Visible Learning is, what it's not, and how it's going to help you fix the problems that you've already identified. We have an overview brochure that we can send you that gives you a detail of the content, and that's a good starting point to have those discussions with me. It's important that we have the discussions because over the last 18 months, 2 years, we've now moved Visible Learning not just from a face-to-face professional development course, but to one that can be blended. So we can offer both virtual and online courses and also face-to-face. So it's important that we have those opportunities to look at what your needs are and how we can make this program bespoke for you. In terms of the online, a lot of schools I've found in recent months have not yet done any kind of online courses with their teachers. So I'll provide a demonstration of what those courses look like. As facilitators, we support you through those. We don't just leave you doing the online courses on your own. I can then provide you with a possible timeline. And I say a possible timeline because this is about evaluative thinking. And so we don't just set out a program and say, that's it for 3 years. We set out the framework of a program and the kinds of elements of the courses that you might want to take on. But what the actual detail of those courses will be very much dependent on our evaluation with you as senior leaders, our evaluation when we're working with the teachers, and then the knowledge before the practice that we need to offer. I can provide further meetings. So if I talk to just you as the head teacher or your deputy, you can then come back to me and we can talk as an extended senior leadership team. I've talked to governors before. It may be that you're part of a MAT and you want to bring in the rest of the schools. And then if you decide that Visible Learning is the program for you, we will introduce you to your lead consultant. I work with a fantastic group of Visible Learning consultants in the UK, and one of those will work with you initially. If you're a large school, there may be 2, there may be 3 consultants that are working with you as well. And we provide updates, we provide support throughout that, through management support. You're not left on your own. We do decide what those 3 years are going to look like together. And before you even think about this should be in your school, we want to make sure it's the right program for you. So hopefully that's a kind of a potted view of what do I do before I even bring this program into my school. Stephen.
Thanks, Wendy. Katie.
Thank you. So if you'd like to start initial conversations just to look at how it might look in your school, or to have a general conversation, then you can book an appointment with me, and that's the first step. So I'll just post my calendar, and that's in the chat section of the webinar. So if you click on the link there, you'll be able to book an appointment. So I'll just pause for 30 seconds whilst you book your appointments, and then we'll come back into the webinar. Thank you. Thank you.
There's lovely. Thank you very much, Katie and Wendy, for joining us on that. And Wendy's worked with literally hundreds of schools across maths and everything, just on the visible learning journey. So any context. There's a good question actually just coming from Larry from Wales, asking, well, the new Welsh curriculum's out. Would visible learning work with the new Welsh curriculum?
Absolutely. I was talking to a Welsh school yesterday, and we were talking about the alignment of the new Welsh curriculum. So absolutely, yes.
I think it's working across about 26 different countries now, isn't it, John? Something like that, in all sorts of different.
For a while, I was actually on the Welsh curriculum review because the minister agreed that he would allow us to take half the stuff out. But unfortunately, that minister changed, and the next one said, no, you're going to put more in, so I withdrew.
It's always difficult, the political games as well as this. However, all we're talking about here is a switch. It doesn't matter what the curriculum is. You're switching from teaching to learning and understanding when the processes are right. Of course, there's a really good time to do teaching with the acquisition levels and fantastic teaching, but the learning bit becomes the crucial bit, and that's the real driver for change on it. Just as while we're talking about this, John, at system level, what does visible learning look like? Because I mean, you originally were working with governments around the world trying to design how could this one work. So what do you find the complications at system level are?
Well, look, doing it one school at a time is fine. And it's going back to what you were saying before, Stephen. I'm not greatly interested in finding problems and fixing them. I want to start on the opposite. Find success and scale it up. At every single school that we've worked in, there are pockets of success. It's building that courage to recognize that pocket of success, forming a coalition of success around that, and inviting others to join. It's the same at the system level. We've got some stunning schools around the world, stunning schools in many countries, and getting systems to have that courage to say, we can show that these schools the kids in these schools are making greater than a year's growth for a year's input. And we know the evidence for this. And forming coalitions and then spreading that message across. The biggest effect of systems, and it's no different in schools, is adopting the language of learning, is to adopt the right language so that we can really focus. And as you know, we've worked in every school in the Northern Territory, most schools in Denmark, whole systems in the US. And it's that constant notion of saying when we talk to each other within our school and across school, we're going to talk about the impact we're having. We're not going to talk about what we do. We're not going to share best practice. We're not going to go and do another professional learning on how to teach this way. We're going to show the impact of what we do. We're going to have debates about that. If we know anything in this business, is having high expectations for all our students has a massive ripple effect. Well, do you know the high expectations of your colleagues? Do you know the high expectations of the schools around you? That's the kind of virus that I want to spread across systems. And it's very powerful when it happens. And you get often much faster traction when you work either at systems level or across schools than if you only work in your own school. We know that there's a real world out there. There are barriers. There are enablers. And we've worked out over the last 10 years what some of those barriers are. Others have worked through those. Why should you be the first to work through that barrier? How do we get that collegiality across schools to work together on these problems? And that's the art and that's the beauty of what we now do across the world in visible learning.
Fantastic. So I think Ursula's just brought us around to another key area here is, okay, so what are these proven strategies? And this was very much the focus of the World's First Learning Survey, which is what we've just taken part. We had 26,000 students worldwide who were filling in this, and they were looking really in depth at the learning. So what John and I are going to do is just go through what those are. So we're going to give you 8, not 5 areas. And some of these are kind of, we talked a little bit about abandonment, areas which you just need to pull away from a little bit because they're actually giving you the wrong messages. So, and John's just started on the first one around expectations. And this is a really interesting question. So this focus on expectations, is this about grades? Is it about confidence? Is it about the questions students are asking and how they're articulating themselves? Or is it about their inner drive to get there? John, your thoughts?
Well, it's all of those, but it's particularly the latter. It's that sense of, if you remember the best teacher you ever had, they probably were that best teacher because they saw something in you didn't see in yourself. So what are the expectations of the teachers? If they have low expectations, we can guarantee that you'll be successful at not having much improvement. So how do you get that? But here's the real fascinating side of it. The effect size of teacher expectations, and when you compare that to student expectations, the student expectations is 3 times the effect of teachers. So do you know what expectations your students have for engaging in the work, for being successful in the work, to being motivated in the work? And that's what we're trying to pull out on the survey to help you understand what the student expectations are. And hopefully then you can see whether yours are sufficiently challenging or whether sometimes lower than the students.
And I'm guessing this is where setting and streaming is so dangerous. If it's undermining the students' expectations of themselves, it needs to be addressed. It's not a kind of, we do this because we've always done it. That's a question of teaching. It's not a question of learning and the expectations. So yeah, fine, do it if you want to do it. But if you're damaging expectations to it, you've got to be really, really aware of that. And I imagine that's going to get a legal issue in the years to come. So, so it's something that schools need to work. Let's talk the second one, because I remember this. The first school I taught at, aim high was the motto of the school, and aiming high obviously sits there. Unfortunately, some of the year 11s misinterpreted that as the way that you aim high. Anyway, but what do we mean actually by this aiming high? And putting some specific definition in. So when we got into the survey here, we're looking at, does that mean trying my best? Does that mean working hard? Does that mean performing well in tests? Is it a useful notion, aiming high?
Well, look, I don't want anyone to do their best, because sometimes your best's not good enough. I want every kid to do better than their best. And so aiming high is understanding where the student is, and it's kind of like using the Goldilocks principle of challenge. You want to raise the bar, not so it's so high that it's unattainable, certainly not it's so low so it's easy, but getting it right so that it's challenging, because it's after about age 8, kids want to be challenged. And so have you aimed sufficiently high? Is there sufficient challenge? Do the students feel challenged? Of course, as we're going to come to it, do they feel supported in that challenge? Is it okay to be challenged in this class? But turning those kids off so that boredom, turning off school is not the aim here. So yes, I want to aim high. But using Goldilocks, not too high, not too low, not too boring.
Okay, so then we come on to that challenge notion that you meant,
Yes.
You put forward there. Is this about me challenging myself as a learner? Is this about me enjoying my learning because I've got it in this kind of notion of flow, which Csikszentmihalyi explained, which is best challenge against best skill level, because that's what drives computer games after all? Or is it about a betterment concept? Or is it all of these and more?
Well, you're certainly right. It's about that flow notion of getting kids to want to strive to be successful. This is one of the reasons that we use success criteria. We understand where the student is. We set a success criteria, not too hard, not too easy, not too boring. And then it's the challenge of trying to do your personal best to get there. And it's like when the kids play the computer games. There's a thrill in the chase of learning. That's what I want to see in our classrooms. So yes, it is about turning kids on to the challenge of learning. Now, Stephen, there's a problem. If we're going to turn them on the challenge of learning, then there's a gap. Kids don't know. They don't know what is in here. That's the role of teaching. And so, as we're going to come to it, you have to have a high trust environment so it's okay to walk into the class and not know. Sadly, a lot of kids by about the age of 8 work out their role in class. Oh, I'm the dummy, or I'm the medium one, or I'm the quiet one. Well, that's not good enough. We have to upset that. That's our job, to mess that up.
Okay, so we'll go on the supportive role and we'll go on to the messing up in a minute. So the teacher help bit, and I guess here that we know we're talking about areas of teachers taking care of how others behave so I can concentrate on my work, of looking at the what are the actions that I take as a teacher that actually encourage me to be a learner, looking at, does the teacher understand my learning strategies? Are they actually developing my learning strategies? Are they trying to impose their own kind of vision of what learning is? And then how are they helping in terms of encouragement and that kind of motivational issue?
Yes, and this notion of, like, kids walk into a class with incredible motivational resources, but sometimes not to do the work we give them. And so this is the art here, is how do we turn them on to the kind of things we want them to be interested in? How do we make it okay so that we teach them that it's okay to seek help from this class? And so I think these are the kind of concerns we're concerned with here, which is getting to the fundamental climate of the class.
So, right, so now we're on to enthusiastic teachers, because I know your bit that you've always said was the most important, two most important things in teaching are, number one, the teacher's got that level of enthusiasm, because otherwise they can't convey anything really to the students in a way that most students want to listen anyway. And then the second element is they can find out something about the students. So the areas that they didn't know about themselves, because this is obviously the awakening of the individual and understanding. So I think the areas we were looking at here was in terms of subject. Did they have the subject knowledge and how important that is, which I'm going to come on to in a moment. The second bit is, do they actually love teaching and the whole process of teaching and the purveying of learning within that. Thirdly, the feedback and the quality of feedback they're able to give it to in such a way that the child actually wants to act upon it and does do something about it, rather than they just kind of, okay, over that one. And then the whole kind of area around about their learning. Is the teacher really focusing on the impact of the learning within that concept?
Yeah, and feedback, as we know, is pretty powerful, but sadly also very variable. And so the motto that we use is, was the feedback heard, understood, and actionable? And moving the focus from teachers and their giving of feedback, yes, that's important. But even more important is what was received, what was understood. Could they action it? And when you ask students, do you get feedback in this class? Sometimes they say no. Even though when you monitor that class, the kids are being given a lot of feedback, but they say no because they don't see it as actionable. They don't see it as about them. They don't see it as a way in which they could use it. And I think this is where we need to focus on feedback a lot more.
Great. And then the next area we went on is this whole area of errors and how, how they're viewed. And I know you've got some very strong views on this one.
I do, Stephen. Like, again, as a DIO tomorrow, I ask your students, what do you do in this class when you don't know what to do? What do you do when you're stuck? And if your students are like virtually every other student I've met in the world, they say the same answer. I ask the teacher. I put my hand up. Then have someone watch them. No, they don't. The only kids who put their hands up are the kids who know the right answer or think they know the right answer. The other kids have learned how to look like you know, but hope you don't get picked. Well, that's not conducive to learning. That's turning off learning. So I want to know what happens with errors in your classroom. When you ask a kid a question and the kid gets it wrong, what do you do? Well, as a study recently showed, over half the time the teacher corrects the kid. 50% of the time the teacher asks another kid who corrects the kid. Less than 3% of the time do we actually deal with the error and understand how you made the error and what happened. So kids learn very, very quickly. Don't make an error in this class. Don't make a mistake. If you do, this class is not for you. And that's sad.
And then this is such a really interesting whole part about human development and particularly teacher development. Because again, with the feedback, with this errors thing, if we ask teachers, they would tell us, and they do, that this is what we're doing. We're doing that in our classroom. And yet when the surveys are done, the studies are done, it's not what happens. And when we do the in-depth, and this is the whole point of this learning survey, we just on the errors, we were looking, does that make you feel disappointed? Does it make you feel worried? What were the important parts in that error as you unpicked it? So this is where we're trying to go with this learning survey, to really dig into these sorts of factors.
A nice, easy way for you to hear how your students are thinking without... Like, go back to the errors problem. The reason that we don't do it, particularly in the Western world, is we care about kids' self-esteem. We don't want to embarrass them. We don't want to turn them off. But the price we pay for that care is the students think that errors aren't welcomed. The survey is a beautiful, simple way of getting a sense of how your students are seeing what it means to make a mistake in your classrooms.
And then the next one we came on to was fairness. This seems to be very important to people. Because I always think there's this kind of beliefs and values, where belief is what I personally believe and my own personal truths, but values seem to be something that comes across humanity, and fairness seems to be one of those things that comes across humanity, that we're very aware if it's unfair to someone else or not. So unpicking this, and one of them was the rules in the classroom, are they applied fairly? Is it, if behaviour management's being used, is it being pushed to certain students rather than other students? And is there an expectation on is there an equal chance for everyone, I guess, within this, and that notion of equity?
Look, of all the surveys ever been done on classroom climate in terms of what kids want out of classrooms, fairness dominates, absolutely dominates. It's not about whether you have strict behavioural control or lax control. They want to have that sense of fairness. And that's one of their major judgments about whether they're going to participate in learning in this classroom. They don't want to be surprised by unfair reactions. And so it's not whether you think you're fair, it's whether they think you're fair. So here's a chance to find out what they think about fairness in your classroom. It's a very powerful influencer of students' learning.
Yeah, I think so. We get some great suggestions here on the site, so it's great for the practical ones. I know I used to do a lot of independent learning work in groups, and the easiest way we did was put a hat at the front and pull the names randomly out the hat. And it was so important that we pulled them out in front of the children so that they all let them pull them out, so they knew there was no bias. As soon as we start trying to select groups, they know immediately, or they're significantly concerned that it's being done and they're being structured and they're being prejudged, and most people hate that. Last one we were looking at then is the whole kind of thing around safety, and I think safety is fascinating because it's got so many different dimensions, and I think we've kind of got a reductive approach to what safety means at the moment, which is important. But when we put it into the learning context, we're talking about to be different as a learner. We're talking about, am I able to voice myself as a learner? And what happens when I do voice myself as a learner? And the whole question around pride, and am I pride, and do I trust in the process of learning to take me forward?
Yeah, and it's that sense of, is this class inviting for me to come? Am I safe here to make mistakes, to learn, to work with other students? Or do I feel like I'm categorized and labeled when I walk into the classroom? And yeah, particularly today when the boundaries between school and society are being even reduced even more. Kids don't leave poverty. They don't leave culture. They don't leave their family at the school gate. They bring it with them. And so to what degree is it safe for them to be seen as learners? Like, again, a lot of kids by the age of 8, they know where they fit in the hierarchy of achievement. And sometimes that's the killer. Every kid, no matter where they start, can add a year's growth for a year's input. And that's what I want them to feel safe about. And that's what I want to see happening in schools right across the UK.
Fabulous. Well, John helped us with that survey and the construct. Those are the 8 areas. So instead of 5, we've given you 8 major impact areas that you're looking at. The results of that survey are currently, we've just got our hands on the raw data, but we haven't managed to get the analysis done as we check it out. We fed back to the schools that were involved. There's about 87 schools that took part in it, and say about 26,000 pupils. And there was another 300 or so who lined up for phase 2, and that's something you can be involved in. We'll have the results fully done. It takes quite a while to crunch those ones through, but we'll be bringing those forward towards the World Education Summit, and we'll be picking up on these. So the World Education Summit, I'm just going to invite Jacob in because John is going to be featuring at the World Education Summit, where we're looking at some of the most fantastic learning going on. If you're part of the last one, brilliant. Tell everyone about this time. So over to you, Jacob.
Hello, thank you very much, Stephen and John. This has been an absolutely fantastic little webinar to just sort of listen into over the last few minutes. Now, hi everyone. If you can't remember me from the beginning, I'm Jacob and I'm the school liaison for the World Education Summit team. Now, at last School Years Festival, John and Stephen facilitated some of the most important conversations in education, and they've done the same today, of course. Now, taking part in these conversations is how we continue to move our profession forward, and I want to make sure that all of you attending today have the chance for you and your school to take part in the World Education Summit 2022. And here, John and Stephen reveal the results of the learning survey firsthand. Now, if you're a school leader and you want to know more about the summit and the year's worth of professional learning that you'll have afterwards, I'd be happy to answer any questions. So what I'm just going to do is I'm going to drop a link to my calendar in the chat. I'm not going to pause for 30 seconds because I know you're all very busy people. So if you'd just like to quickly click on that link, book in a very quick chat with me, and we'll go through what it'll look like in your school.
Fantastic. Thank you, Jacob. And there's all sorts of questions about the references of what we talked about there. John has a 93-page CV, which is just the work that he's cited in, let alone what he's drawing on and pulling on. Now, in terms of being able to drink in the planet of educational research, make some sense of it, and then be able to advise people across the world on it and stuff like that. I back John every day. So it's huge amounts there. It's all contained within the visible learning work, because a lot of that was drawn into it. What was the how many students research was it in the end, Jordan? John, over 250 million and rising.
A billion.
A billion. And how many studies?
Over 100,000. And last week, actually, the 1700th meta-analysis. So it's continuing all the time.
So that work's ongoing, but we won't list the full 100,000 that have come from. But what we will do, and it's just brilliant to be joined by John at all these times, is we'll just keep trying to keep this moving and this story moving. The story overall isn't changing. We're not getting, some schools are getting closer to learning, and it's great that we're moving that way. Governments keep changing and moving around. We'll keep pushing learning, and that's what the World Education Summit's about. How do we get to learning as a profession? But massive thanks, John, for joining us today from Melbourne, and I hope they let you out of lockdown soon again, and the sun shines
by the summer.
Great. So thank you so much.
Thank you,
and thanks so much, Wendy, for you joining us as well and bringing that expertise in.
Thanks, Stephen.